Out of Left Field, we have our post-2019 Canadian federal election post-mortem.
Yeah, post-mortem. We're going to be picking through to find those precious pieces of corn in the pile that of the election.
What? Pieces of corn.
Yes. Sorry, I didn't want to say the word, but shit.
Oh, right. Gotcha. Okay. So I have returned from my extended stay in the Great Satan to the south of us. Mac, thank you so much for taking care of my apartment while I was gone. You killed only 2 of my plants. Sorry, I had to say it. So,
you know I'm editing this episode, right?
So, we're the NDP had a, I guess, worse than expected results.
It was exactly as expected.
Yeah, okay.
By some.
So lost a bunch of seats. Liberals maintained power with a minority government.
I don't know why you're talking about this. It's like, look, if you're out there listening, you already know what happened. Unless you're like me and basically have been in a fugue state for like quite a while now. Just like, election happened, results come in. I don't know, NDP did bad, Liberals suck. That's basically my view.
Yeah, well, and the Conservatives actually got a larger share of the vote than the Liberals did, but way fewer seats. So we are going to be talking about the election with friend of the show, Doc Curry, joining us from Kamloops, and here's our interview with him.
And I'm Mac, co-host of the show.
I'm Ben, producer and co-host.
Yep. Hi, Anthony here. Thanks for tuning in, listeners, to another exciting episode of Out of Left Field. We are here to do our post-election, post-mortem, wrap-up, salving of our election blues, whatever you want to call it. And for that, we've brought on a friend of the show and a past guest as well, Doc Curry. Doc is a second-year law student at Thompson Rivers University and an honorably or dishonorably, depending on how you look at it, disbarred perhaps, member of the NDP's Federal Electoral Revolutionary Vanguard. How you doing, Doc? Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, as always. Yeah, it's pretty good here. Pretty interesting times that we live in, and yes, there's some stories to be told about the electoral shenanigans in Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou, but there's also stories to be told about the whole cross-country scene and what it means for the next 4 years if it holds together, or 4 weeks if it doesn't.
Well,
Glad to be
with you
guys.
It is the greatest misfortune to have been born in interesting times, and here we are.
I thought you were going to say it was they'd say it's the greatest misfortune to be born in Kamloops.
Oh. Well, that actually brings it right home, and maybe before we get into the general overview, Doc, you could just let us know how things went in your riding for our listeners elsewhere in Canada and in other parts of the province who might not be aware. How did you come to receive your spot running for the NDP, and how did things ultimately go?
Yeah, you were you were representing them for about 2.5 minutes, from what I understand.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. So what happened was that here in Kamloops there was a candidate, a great candidate, kind woman, Gina Myhill-Jones, who had to drop out for personal reasons, and that was late August when that happened. And so, 2 months before an election, they don't have a candidate. And so various members of the Kamloops Thompson Caribou Electoral District Association and various leftist activists in the community, they said, well, hey, Doc's always ranting and raving about how we got to run earnest grassroots social democratic campaigns. Let's get him to run an earnest social democratic grassroots campaign. And so they basically drafted me, and I lasted for about 2 weeks. We can get into the reasons for why that happened, but basically some pipeline proponents that I'd vociferously argued with 2 years ago.
Were you too earnest, Doc? Were you too earnest?
Too grassroots.
I always am. I mean, like, this is the weird thing. Basically, what it boils down to,
Salty, yeah.
why I didn't end up being the candidate, was that the Electoral District Association here and the leftist members, they knew what I was about. They knew what they were getting, but National didn't. And so when National sees this, acrimonious fight with two pipeline proponents, they're like, oh, well, this is weird. We don't want to litigate this. We don't want to have this fight in the middle of an election. But they got it anyway because Rachel Notley was slagging off Jagmeet, throughout the election. So basically they just said, this isn't going to work. We got to get someone else. And so they got another lady to be the candidate, and she had a different perspective. I'm not going to slag her off. She did the best that she could with limited time, and she had a different way of approaching things. I mean, one anecdote that I could kind of just tell to give you a sense of what the difference was that in one of the debates or one of the forums, the Green, Ian Curry, another Curry, guy with similarly the name Curry, he was in an argument with Terry Lake and Kathy McLeod, the Liberal and the Conservative, respectively. And Ian was saying what Terry, the Liberal, is saying is the greatest falsehood that Terry is propagating is that investment in a just transition off of fossil fuels would not be in and of itself a tremendous economic opportunity and a opportunity to drive economic growth. And Cynthia Egley, who, as I say, is a wonderful woman and a proud union activist, her response to this was, oh, well, you guys are just being divisive. You're all being divisive, and Canadians want, us to be not divisive. Were I to have still been the candidate, I would have said, Ian is right. The Greens, they don't have a class analysis. They don't have a critique of capitalism, but it is true. The slight that Ian is articulating, that Terry and the Conservatives, for that matter, are articulating, that they're trying to portray a just transition off of fossil fuels as an economic disaster. And that's disingenuous and inaccurate. And had I been in the ring at that moment, I would have made a point to have weighed in and invade on the side of growth and the just transition being an economic driver rather than a deleterious thing for Canadian economy.
Well,
and that's kind of like that's the difference.
Doc, I have to say I'm a little disappointed because I was expecting your comment about bringing the guillotine back was going to be what the NDP takes you out over, not any pedestrian argument with fossil fuel advocates.
That's what my mom said. My mom was like, they could have nailed you to the wall on like literally anything.
You said worse things to me in person.
I didn't get to litigate my Baathism is a stabilizing influence on the Middle East position. I didn't get to litigate my we should care about Palestinian human rights position. There's a whole bunch of stuff that it's just so funny that like this one thing. Oh, that's the weird thing that you've had acrimonious fights about. I was like, I've had acrimonious fights about everything, man. That's why.
We should have been so lucky as to have you sitting on the Foreign Policy Committee in an NDP government situation, just like we should all be so lucky as to have our mothers as our, best political advisors and confidants at times like this.
I said you could frame, it's like you could say, oh, we got to condemn Israeli apartheid. That's the bad one. People are going to get mad at you. Or you could say, we are concerned about a lack of commitment to the two-state solution. It's like 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. It's this, if you invest a position with more enthusiasm than certain career staffers are comfortable with, then, they get cold feet and kick sand on it. And I just think that that's kind of, counterproductive insofar as I think that the membership and socialists and social democrats across Canada, they want people to be vociferous. They want their advocates to be passionate about the issues that they take on, and that's that kind of, oh, you've been, past the point where we're comfortable with that level of, boisterousness or whatever. I think that's a problem. I don't know, hang me or whatever, but I think if we're going to be kneecapping the people who've actually been fighting fights and taking strong positions, then what we're going to get is a sanitized, watered down version of social democracy that's not going to appeal to a great percentage of working class and marginalized people. We need to get out to the polls.
Let me just jump in now, Doc. I mean, I completely agree with you, and I think that your analysis really bears out, just zooming out, not only in your own riding, but in a lot of what we saw in eastern BC and in the northern interior in terms of blue votes seemingly coming out of nowhere and catching people by surprise. Although I think if you've got a kind of economic class analysis of the situation in a lot of those places, then maybe it wasn't necessarily so surprising. That is, it's quite upsetting because exactly what you say about missed opportunities by the NDP and their campaigning in these parts of the country for really capturing that kind of passionate investment in the economic kind of frustration and devastation a lot of these communities are seeing. That was more of a kind of broad and general problem. I'm wondering if you can just kind of speak to that, zooming out again from what happened in your own riding, but also what we saw a lot in the region of BC that you're in. And maybe the country.
So we can go there. We can talk about that, but I think that we should contextualize it. I think that we should first talk about what went right. It's like what we're trying to do here is build a movement and an institution that is capable of taking on the political parties that serve the interests of large capital, whether that be large Laurentian capital in the case of the Liberals or large oil sands capital in the case of the Conservatives, by and large. And so, I do think that we should kind of start first by just saying what the NDP did right. I mean, you got Carl Belanger and the Mulcair section calling for Jagmeet's head, saying, oh, he should go, it was a disastrous result, blah, blah, blah. You've got Rachel Notley up on a high horse saying, oh, he wants to hurt jobs. There's a lot of people slagging off the NDP right now, and I don't want to be just equated with someone who's just slagging off the NDP. I want to say that there's a lot of things that went right in this election. Let's talk about those first. And so what are those things? First of all, Jagmeet Singh was an excellent spokesperson. Okay, he came in a bad situation because Trudeau had delayed his by-election in Burnaby South. He came in late, didn't have a lot of time, and he had to kind of triage. And on the campaign trail, he was a great spokesperson. He was able to deconstruct questions and put forth earnest social democratic answers in a way that Mulcair had not been able to do in 2015. And that galvanized him a lot of support. Now we could say, oh, well, you got 15 less seats than Mulcair and you got, basically, less popular vote than Mulcair. Right, fair enough. But Mulcair had sat on his ass and collected a paycheck for 2 years and done nothing to build the party. It could have been a lot worse, and Jagmeet's energy, enthusiasm, capacity as a spokesperson mitigated that to a great extent and allowed for a victory of 24 MPs and basically a halfway decent popular vote. So no, I'm not on the bandwagon with let's get rid of Jagmeet, blah blah blah. He was an excellent spokesperson. I think he's just earned the right to try to grow into the role of leader of the party.
Absolutely.
I hope that he comes out here. I hope that he comes out everywhere and actually does that job of building the party, because I think he did a really good job. That's number one thing that I think went really well this election. I don't know if you guys have other ones.
Yeah, I mean, I was actually quite pleasantly surprised overall with how Singh did. I've been critical of what I perceive to be kind of very centrist neoliberal politics coming from him, but he actually ran pretty very left-wing principled campaign. He was for the most part pretty on point. He did well in the debates. He was well spoken. He especially when put up against Trudeau and Scheer and May, and certainly what's his nuts from the People's Party, who didn't even win his seat. Ha! Fucker!
Yay!
Burn.
When put in a room with all those clowns, I thought Singh was great, and he ran a pretty principled campaign. There was an instance here. In fact, our friend Lee Phillips was supposed to be on this episode with us, but he was unfortunately come down with the flu.
He got the flu because he
Traitor.
did not get his
Traitor for
flu
getting the
shot
flu.
this year. And if you're interested in knowing how absolutely, utterly, idiotically hypocritical that is, you should listen to the episode of Chapo Trap House he's on and hear about how he rants and raves about the need for better medication and development.
Class of antibiotic.
Yeah,
and
antibiotics.
yeah.
And he didn't get his goddamn flu shot, so he can't come on our show.
We're a very pro flu shot podcast, people. Go to
Yeah.
Walmart.
Oh
get
yes.
flu
Also,
shot.
go get your shots if you haven't got them yet. You don't. I know you don't need them, but it's called herd immunity. It works. Do it.
Don't carry disease.
And
That's
so
all.
I think I brought him up because he actually posted a pretty good election analysis on Facebook where, in spite of everything great that I've just said about Jagmeet Singh, there was an event here, I think, in town where there was a First Nations person that asked about, like, listen, I know we have to stop climate change. I know that we have to, avert all boiling alive due to the global heating. But, there are people in my community that depend on oil and natural gas jobs. And so, like, how do you square that circle? Like, what are you going to tell my community if you're going to be opposing these infrastructure projects and these resource extraction projects? And he didn't. He kind of waffled on it. Basically, he didn't really have a clear answer to that. So there were certain instances when Jagmeet could have done better. But I think overall he impressed me. He did, ran a pretty good campaign. And, I actually felt pretty good about voting for him. I certainly felt good about voting for Laurel Collins, who beat out the Green candidate here in Victoria.
Rather handily, in fact.
Yeah?
It wasn't
Yes.
nearly as close as I thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
But that's
Okay,
Vancouver
okay, but-
Island. We're just, we're going to
Okay,
vote
but
NDP forever.
Let's talk about that question, though. Let's talk about that question that he got asked, and he didn't have as coherent or as structured an answer as you might have wanted. And I think that's true. And I think that it extends further than Jagmeet Singh. I think that extends to the current economic orientation of the policy. I mean, it would have been an issue here in Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou as well, where 4 out of 5 people are basically, either ambivalent or in favor of the pipeline. And being a vociferous opponent of the pipeline, it was going to be an uphill battle for me as well. But what do you have to say to these people? You can't just say, as Don Davies and Peter Julian and, all of the lower mainland crew said, oh, you bought a pipeline. You guys are hypocrites. You don't care about climate action. That is a line that's just not going to resonate with people who are economically starved for jobs. And so what is a line that would resonate with them? It's a line that says, hey, the BC Liberals and successive federal Liberal and Conservative governments have allowed 40,000 jobs to hemorrhage out of the forestry sector in the BC interior. And there's been very little in the way of remediation or addressing the tremendous economic concerns that people have in eastern British Columbia and heading into the now entirely blue provinces. And what do you say to them? Is I think that the problem is that the NDP has a platform where they have some programs that 500,000 units of affordable housing across the country, 300,000 jobs in green energy and home conversions. But what is the mechanism by which those programs actually come into effect? Basically, it's a public tendering process. P3s, public-private partnerships, which the NDP used to be steadfastly against and has now kind of backslid and is ambivalent about / will deploy them when it's convenient. And I think that's a problem. I think that you've got to be able to say to these people, hey, if there's a mill closure, the federal government is willing to step in and buy that mill or bring it under public ownership. The unwillingness to broach the notion of public ownership, I think, is an underlying problem with where the party is at right now in terms of economics. And were I to have been the candidate in Kamloops Thompson Caribou, I basically wouldn't have that quill, that arrow in my quiver. I wouldn't have been able to earnestly say the party is committed to strategic public ownership when it makes sense, where it's a viable alternative to the modes of production and exchange that are currently obtaining. And I think that would have hamstrung me, and I think that a number of different candidates felt kind of hamstrung in that sense. So when Jagmeet says, kind of waffles on the issue of oil and gas or
what do you
LNG,
do? Yeah.
What do you do? What do you do? These kinds of things. I think it's because I don't want to demean him. I don't want to slag him off, but Rachel Notley, she gets up on her horse, and in addition to say he's got to stop hurting jobs, he's got to blah, 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 she says he hasn't done his research. Well, I think that's inaccurate, and I think that's the crummy way of phrasing it. But I also think that Jagmeet does need to look at the issue, and if his position is that he's against the Trans Mountain expansion, then he's got to know the reasons for that and be vociferous with the reasons for that. And why isn't he against LNG? And why does he simply defer to the BC NDP? The BC NDP is the party of provincial power right now, so a lot of deference has to be paid to them, and so you don't go just slagging off the fact that they're invested, in this $40 billion LNG thing and Site C and whatever. I understand that. But at the same time, he's the leader of the federal party. He can't just be a deferent appendage to the party of provincial power in British Columbia. He's got to rise above both Rachel Notley and John Horgan. And that's a difficult thing to do because, he's relying on the institutional structures of the BC NDP. He's relying on this kind of amalgamated, built-up power base. And so to really sort out where his loyalties and his positions and his principles lay with respect to all of the different issues in Western Canada to do with economic prosperity, jobs, oil and gas, First Nations concerns, constitutional obligations, he's got to get up to speed really fast. And I don't think that we saw that kind of already sorted out in this election.
Well, I think that's something that we would all be broadly sympathetic with, the idea that they do lack a kind of coherent economic and class analysis of things like mass oil divestment. And so when they get in campaign season caught up in, on the one hand, what seems to be this quite popular demand on the left to just go full-blown mass oil divestment and invest 100% in clean energy and renewables, that does leave them a little bit hamstrung, because if they're serious about taking power, you will have to invest in these economies and in these communities. You're going to have to spend money, and the only way to guarantee that will both create prosperity and not, risk completely destabilizing these communities, or much worse, or as bad, our ability to hit our decarbonization targets, then you're going to have to look at things like public ownership and actually, investing in, say, value-added product, rather than, bending over backwards to get the cheapest raw product, both in the oil industry and from the tar sands and in resource logging, to international markets like in the US and elsewhere in China. That's really kind of a broader problem, and we can say this about the NDP any election, that they aren't speaking consistently and coherently enough and on a kind of class basis. All of the talk tends to gravitate around the middle class Canadians, and tapping into that anxiety, I think, my reading, maybe we can get into this later, is that's just kind of trying to fight the liberals and the conservatives on their own playing field, and I don't think it's ever really going to work out.
And I think also it's important to mention, and I'm just going to kind of speak without permission on behalf of Lee Phillips, who is not here, but we shouldn't be calling to completely shut down the oil and gas industries, because we still need plastics, we still need petrochemicals for all sorts of different things that human beings rely on. The goal, is twofold. One, that we should stop using fossil fuels for transportation, and basically wherever we are able to cut it out. And secondly, to make the extraction of said oil and gas to be as carbon neutral as possible. So if we can reduce the emissions from the extraction of oil and gas, that's the goal, because we're still going to need some amount of it to make stuff that people use. You brought up a really good point about this whole conversation about the middle class. Everyone wants to get the middle class vote because plenty of people identify as middle class, although that number is decreasing year after year.
It's actually not that large.
The boundaries are completely unclear
anymore.
too. It's everybody can think of themselves as middle class. It's the new fiction.
Sure, but I mean, self-identified working class Canadians moved in huge numbers from the Liberals to the Conservatives this election. You'd think that, the NDP, the party of the working class,
Labor.
the CCF, Labor,
Blah, blah,
all
blah.
that, you'd think that it would have been kind of a no-brainer that people would go to them. But they did not. They went to the Conservatives, who self-profess to stand up for the little guy.
Jobs.
Just
All
jobs.
You need to, in all honesty, all you have to do to make a halfway okay case to working class people is say, I will make it so that you will have a job. That is one thing you don't have to worry about.
Or a better one than you have now.
Or just anything. Or and I mean, and to be fair, a lot of what the Conservatives are appealing to, I think, is something that like leftists and social democrats should be saying. The job of the government is to make your life easier. The Liberals love bureaucracy, and they will make your life insanely complicated through a series of
tax credits
and checks and balances and means-tested bullshit, whereas the Conservatives can say, we'll just obliterate all of that and that'll make your life simpler. The argument from Social Democrats should be, we will introduce systems that you don't have to apply for through some Byzantine system. You can just you get like healthcare. Everyone loves healthcare because you can just go to the hospital and you don't need to worry about it. People like that their kids are going to public education because they can just send their kids to school and they don't have to worry about it. Services that people can just access easily without any bullshit.
Well,
they
did do that with dental and pharmacare.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and I couldn't agree more, Mac. I love the way you phrased it. But I think that also points back to the lack of a kind of consistent analysis on these terms. Is when they did hit upon a policy like that, it pulled really well and got them a lot of strong support, but it's not consistent enough.
Here's the thing that I think about it is on the campaign trail, you've got to have these messages that are 5 or 6 word sound bites. The Liberals are in it for their big rich buddies, and the Conservatives say, it's time for you to get ahead, like they've ever done that. And the Liberals, it's this vacuous thing is like, oh, we choose forward. You don't want Harper, you want to get ahead, blah, blah, blah. And that's fine for an election. I don't begrudge them for having done that during an election. But now that we're in the post-election scene, you can't just have these, taglines and index headings.
Yeah.
You've actually got to articulate the reasons behind each and every one of them. And I have a concern that the NDP, where it is economically, and not just JAGME, but the NDP, where it is economically, isn't oriented towards those long paragraph length, detailed answers. It's one thing to say, I'm against the Trans Mountain expansion, and I've been clear on that, quote unquote. It's another thing to lay out the reasons that, hey, we can have an economic system which is ecologically sustainable and provides jobs, and also these projects have had poor consultation processes and they offend the Salish people and the Secwepemc people. And also, this represents a risk of a catastrophic bitumen spill in vulnerable coastal habitats. These are all arguments that need to be actually made and prosecuted. And it remains to be seen, to me, whether these arguments will be sufficiently prosecuted in their lengthy exegesis, as opposed to the campaign rhetoric of simple campaign slogans.
If I had any major complaint about the NDP, fundamentally, it's the situation it's in outside of elections. Like, it seems that there's this big ramp up to elections and like getting people involved, getting people excited, getting people giving them money, and then literally after the election, nothing, dead, silence. This is a little different because it's a minority government, so I think they're sort of going to act like it's an election season anyway, because it, kind of is. But normally, once I've given my vote away, that's it. I'm done. We'll email you in 3.5 years for more money. Don't worry about it.
That's not true, Mac. I mean, in the 4-year interim, they're constantly asking for money. That's their entire, democratic platform for their membership.
Sorry. Well, I have a spam filter, so.
Okay, well, we've talked about Western Canada. Let's kind of talk about the rest of Canada. Can we talk about the Quebec?
Well, hold on.
equation?
There's one crucial thing that we have not discussed about Western Canada, is this insufferable bullshit about hashtag Wexit. We exit. Wexit.
I agree.
And I just want to say that from my point of view, everything that comes out of Alberta, with the singular exception of one podcast that some of you listeners might also listen to, is just insufferable, inarticulate screeching from Alberta. They complain when they lose. They complain when they win. They play the victim when they lose. They play the victim when they win.
You know what?
Boo fucking who? The Western provinces, with the singular exception of the west coast of BC and Vancouver Island, has
where a lot of
voted
people are.
solidly conservative for my entire fucking lifetime.
Nothing
has changed.
As someone who was born in Alberta but got way the fuck out of there super quick at the ripe old age of 4 or 5, I'm actually going to give critical support to hashtag Wexit, except BC are going to go hashtag Cascadey out, and we are going to take the Yukon, we're taking California, Oregon with us.
I don't want to be in the same country as fucking California.
Why not? We can help support their mass reforestation effort along
don't
with
just take all our
Oregon
water,
in
is what
exchange for better deal on our log.
Okay, well, can I say something about Wexit here? There's basically, you say it's like, oh, there's one podcast, but there's also 350.org, which is young climate activists who feel like they've been excluded from the provincial party of the Alberta NDP, and I think that's true. I think that it's part of this kind of suppression of the grassroots, the most vibrant elements of the party across the country, and the way that expresses itself in Alberta is the exclusion of young climate activists, young left-wing voices who know the problems with the line that Rachel Notley is putting out there, and who want to change it. I mean, there are, Andrew Coyne had this big argument about we need proportional representation because because the way that we vote now is stoking rather than ameliorating all of these regional divisions. And I think that's true. Yeah, I think it's true. I think the problem...
Andrew Coyne sometimes just hits it on the head.
I mean, he's right. I just think it's funny that, I think the real reason Andrew Coyne wants proportional representation is just so it'll give him more opportunities to do horse racing opinion pieces.
Sure, maybe.
Okay,
Let me finish this point.
Sure.
The point is that there's young climate activists in Alberta. 30% of Alberta didn't vote for the Conservatives. There's a whole sea of blue, but 30% of the population had other ideas about what to do, and those people feel profoundly disenfranchised and left out of the political process, which is really unfortunate. I mean, you've got the top level of so-called progressivism in Alberta, and who constitutes that? It's Rachel Notley, Naheed Nenshi, and a few other, David Kahn of the Alberta Liberals. It's these people who are trying to make a faux progressive kind of front, while at the same time being vociferously pro-pipeline. And I think that, to my mind, unfortunately, a lot of what this Wexit thing boils down to is simply nothing matters except we get our, massive oil and gas subsidy. People forget that in order to construct this expansion, it's going to cost an additional $9 to $11 billion. So over and above the $4.5 billion that we've already handed over free and clear from the public purse to these massive oil companies, sorry for your troubles with democracy. Sorry that the Constitution got in your way. Here, have $4.5 billion. What the establishment figures, Jason Kenney, Andrew Scheer, etc., and these pseudo-cosmopolitan figures like Notley and Nenshi are absolutely after is you must give us $9 to $11 billion to construct an additional oil and gas pipeline. And the point that I'm trying to make is that there are people in Alberta that see how fruitless and how counterproductive that impetus is, and they're being drowned out. They're being silenced. And I think that, at least on the quote-unquote progressive side, I think that the Alberta NDP would actually do much better were it not to disenfranchise and muzzle and silence its most vibrant climate change activists, like the young people in 350.org.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And, I have to just do myself a favor and go back and qualify my earlier ill attempt at humor and, shout out those people in Alberta as well. I mean, myself and most of my family are from the Edmonton Strathcona riding, which is proudly the one tried and true orange dot in an entire sea of blue.
You gotta let me know though. Is Heather McPherson going to be a thorn in the side of the NDP for the next 4 years?
Oh, I mean, yeah, we'll have to see. It's they kind of tend more social democrat, but time will tell, because there's definitely a lot of that kind of more anti-establishment energy bubbling up in those areas too. But what I want to say is, I mean, you're absolutely right about the fact that there is all this kind of like young progressive energy in Alberta. I mean, there was a mass climate strike. Greta Thunberg came to Edmonton, and the organizers of that strike were expecting 2,000-3,000 people maybe, and then 20,000 showed up. So it was quite a spectacular event. And I've been speaking as well with friends and family in Calgary and Edmonton, and they're telling me that growing really fed up with a lot of this kind of slagging off Alberta from mainly centrist liberal folk outside of Alberta, who are really kind of painting with a broad brush and pegging them all as a bunch of reactionary racist assholes.
Not
yeah.
like you.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's
from Alberta, all right? You heard he was there until he was 4.
Yeah, exactly. I used to go back every summer. No, but the point is this, that we have to see a lot of those blue votes as not being the kind of dyed-in-the-wool hardcore conservative voters that will have another 40-year dynasty of conservatism in Alberta, because the economic conditions in Alberta simply don't make that possible. So that being said, there is still a really strong ideological hold that conservatism has in Alberta. So my 2-minute take is just that it's really going to be impinged on hard work of a lot of these grassroots activists in Victoria to have a lot of one-on-one conversations or else in small groups and do that hard work of changing hearts and minds and bringing them over to a more left class-based perspective of their plight, which is very real.
Oh, okay. I do not intend with this upcoming statement, which I apologize for in advance, to slag off any progressive activists from Alberta.
Uh-oh.
But I could not give a single solitary fuck about any whinging from Alberta, because Norway's trust fund that they, or whatever the fuck, they set up for their nationalized, socialized
sovereign wealth fund.
Thank you, is worth 1.2 trillion with a T fucking dollars, because they actually managed their resources properly for the last 60 years.
Here's the only thing with that, though, is that if, and this is actually kind of true, if Alberta had the same level of royalties put on their oil barons that Norway did, those oil barons would not have actually invested in Alberta. They don't care. They want money. They're not interested in sovereign wealth funds or anything else.
Okay, but we're not talking about just the oil sands. I mean, we're just talking about oil. I mean, the oil industry in Alberta for the last 2 generations.
Yes.
Since
the Iran-Iraq war, basically, which, if the price of oil ain't going to go up to the point where they'll get back to the good days again, unless that happens again. Unless there's a second Iran-Iraq war, Alberta's oil prices are kind of just going to be crap.
Right, and I think that's another argument that really needs to be prosecuted, is that spending $9 to $11 billion on an additional pipeline is not not going to restore the price of crude oil to $120 a barrel. In 2014, it crashed from over 100 to around $40 or $50 a barrel. And that was a tremendous economic hit to Alberta, and we all understand that. At the same time, Alberta has refused to diversify its economy over the last 40 years, and it refused to under an NDP government. And why is the Sovereign Wealth Fund so small in Alberta and not in Norway? Mac, you got a good point that barons wouldn't have invested in the same way had they had the same level of royalties. At the same time, the reason why it's so small in Alberta is because Alberta has artificially kept its corporate tax rate incredibly low for decades and decades on the back of oil wealth. So it's this massive ongoing giveaway to large oil and gas corporations at the expense of working people, at the expense of people on the ground in Alberta. And now they're in dire straits, and they're saying, "Oh well, throw us a bone, give us $10 billion worth of oil and gas subsidy." Well, we got to discuss it within the historical context of you guys haven't done economically responsible things for a long, long time, and so is it everyone else's responsibility to just throw them a bone of $10 billion? I think that's really open for debate. I think that's not an already made argument.
I'm happy, and I think the rest of the country would be happy to provide $10 billion in humanitarian aid to Alberta. But not to just build a fucking pipeline.
That's hilarious, because the real irony here with Alberta is that, for all that the Alberta Conservatives shit on socialism, even to the point of building a $30 million war chest to attack whomever they think the foreign-funded climate activists are or might be. They actually have a lot more in common. Their history economically has a lot more in common with Venezuela, in that they were able to buy a kind of a relative class peace in kind of declining economic conditions after an initial boom in oil. But the failure to kind of diversify their economy, except that Alberta did this through, never having a provincial sales tax on goods, very kind of populist things like that, keeping oil prices kind of artificially low, gas prices at the pump artificially low. So yeah, that connection there, I'm sure would rustle the jimmies of a lot of blue working class voters.
I'm not sure exactly which level of government this was, but I know that I think it was provincial in Alberta, where they canceled like $60 million worth of public transportation and health and education and social services, and then like 2 fucking days later approved a $250 million subsidy to build a new fucking stadium somewhere. Mm-hmm. So this
Oilers stadium.
Yeah, the whole notion about them wanting to cut government spending is bullshit. It's just it's nonsense. They just hate poor people. That's it.
You know what's really funny about that Oilers stadium is immediately adjacent to it is the tallest fucker of a building in Western Canada, which my uncle was boasting about when he was driving us back from the airport to our place in Edmonton, Strathcona, after he was boasting about their low gas prices. It's like 70 fucking stories tall, and it sticks out like a massive cock in the middle of Alberta, Edmonton downtown, saying "fuck you" to the rest of the country.
Yeah, I saw it. I was there.
Yeah, it's awful.
You can see it.
It made my mind throb a little.
It's like the Eye of Sauron.
Yeah,
it's sort of there.
Yeah,
in the
exactly.
Distance, watching you.
Okay, so do we want to discuss Quebec now? I got some thoughts.
One thing I do want to just say about the whole like Alberta all being blue thing for leftists is like we criticize First Past the Post for not being really at all representative of what Canadians or whoever actually want. This is sort of just to anyone who's leftist. You can't both be critical of First Past the Post and assume a homogenous opinion of Albertans. Like it's incoherent, because there is a lot of people in Alberta who vote for the Conservatives just because they're like, well, what else am I going to do? Like, what is the choice? They promised jobs, they promised to help me, and nothing else seems to be able to ever get elected anyway, so who the fuck cares?
I think I'd like to just pick up that point and put out a question about proportional representation and strategic voting in this election. It seems to kind of transition nicely. We can come back to the Quebec thing maybe afterwards, and I also just want to bracket I have to leave in a few minutes, so I'm just gonna put this question.
You guys are gonna make this an entirely BC Alberta episode.
No.
We're
don't worry about it.
implicitly for hashtag Wexit. No, that's just the Western alienation talking, baby. But we will, and I would love to talk about Quebec, but I'm gonna have to chat. There was an interesting poll or study article posted by CBC talking about how things might have looked in terms of the composition of Parliament had we had one of the pro-rep systems that was on the table in the last election, and it would have resulted in a conservative minority, even more slim margins than the Liberals have now, which listeners will note is the slimmest minority government that we have ever had in the history of Canadian electoralism.
Really? Even more slim than Paul Martin's.
I mean, Andrew Coyne said so I'm assuming it's fucking true.
Fuck that guy.
At any rate, the NDP would have almost doubled their seats from 24 to 54. The Bloc would have had 26 instead of 32. The Green Party would have had 7 times the MPs elected at 22 instead of 3. And for better or worse, the People's Party would have had 6 MPs in the House instead
So
of
6 more conservatives.
Yeah, essentially.
And you wouldn't have had the tremendous acrimony between the NDP and the Greens in the Lower Mainland and on the island. I mean, I find the whole thing with the leaflets and it was just on all sides. It was acrimonious and horrible, and that's what a first past the post election does to progressive parties. It pits them against one another and makes them highlight their differences. And is there problems with the Greens? Yes, they picked up Pierre Nantel, and an explicit condition of him joining the Greens was that he be allowed to support Quebec's racist Bill 21. They don't have they don't have whip, or they don't ensure a principled line on a women's right to choose, and things like 9/11 conspiracy theories and Islamophobia, etc. There are many things wrong with the Greens, and there are many things wrong with the NDP. I think that the NDP had a poor vetting process. There are things to be said about both parties. But when we have a first past the post election, the sociological reality of that is that these people, the Greens and the NDP, yes, the Greens are a bit more white. Yes, the NDP is a bit more corporatist and top down. But we usually agree on like 90% of the issues. And during a first past the post election, suddenly we're mortal enemies that need to tear down and destroy one another. And I just think that is...
I am absolutely a mortal enemy of the Green Party. I fucking hate them.
Oh.
Well, the problem that we're going to face is that now the majority in Parliament is going to be absolutely an immortal enemy of any kind of pro-rep system, because, in those numbers I just shared, the Conservatives actually lost votes too, even if it would have given them the minority, the lead in the minority. So, what's going to be the role of the Greens and the NDP and the Bloc well, fuck Maxime Bernier. What's the role of those three parties to, build demand for pro-rep and to continue to kind of push that demand against the two mainstream parties, Liberals and the Conservatives, who now, plain as day, have zero vested interest in supporting it?
Well, I mean, the Bloc doesn't really have much interest in pro-rep either, because first past the post favors parties that have regional support. So even though the Bloc got half as much of the vote share as the NDP did, they still managed to get like twice as many seats because, they, being a Quebec party, to the surprise of no one, has concentrated support in Quebec. And so they're able to eke by with a lot more seats, even though they have way fewer votes. And this has historically disproportionately affected the NDP and the Greens, who I hate, because they have kind of diffuse national support. So, like, in any given riding, you're going to have
find
15 to 20% of people will, support the NDP.
Whereas no one in Victoria is going to support the Bloc. Although,
yeah, you're right.
Funnily enough, not in this election, but in the election, the last one where the Bloc got completely obliterated they were actually polling better in Western Canada than they were in Quebec. The Bloc. When people asked, like, what party would you support? more people said, yeah, I'd vote for the Bloc. Fuck it.
We have a lot of Quebecois fruit pickers.
Which I
here.
think is just another example of Western alienation. They go, oh, they're separatists? Good. Fuck off. I'll vote for Quebec to fuck off. I think that's what people were thinking.
I'm going to say one last thing, and then I'm going to fuck off. And it zooms in on the Quebec situation specifically. And, I was also surprised by how well the Bloc did in this election. I think a lot of people were. One thing that we should look at, though, is the results of the last provincial election and the provincial government in Quebec. I don't think that the support that we saw for the Bloc was a vote for sovereignty. Exit polls show that they were mainly interested in climate change as the key political issue. And, polls from past elections as well as the provincial elections show that socioeconomic inequality is still a huge issue. In the last provincial election, we saw the collapse of the main centrist parties. We saw the meteoric rise of the CAQ, which is François Legault's. I know, it's also slang for poop. It's very
But not in
entertaining.
Quebec, so they don't know that.
Yeah.
So it's funny.
Yeah, so we saw the rise of this far-right economically nationalist party, but we also saw the rise, that said, of Québec Solidaire, which is a more leftist party. Their spokespeople either overtly identify as socialists. One of them was, a previous leader of all the Quebec student movements and student strikes in 2015. So, they are to the left of the NDP in the province, and it would be really interesting going forward to see if the NDP could be pushed left enough to be able to receive some kind of support or endorsement from Québec Solidaire in Quebec to be able to steal some of those votes back, because I don't think Quebec is a write-off. I was surprised, but this just shows that there's a lot of work that can be done there by the orange tide, so to speak.
Well, I've said in the past that I was always under the impression that the NDP surge in Quebec was a one-night stand, and history has absolved me.
No, it hasn't. We got more votes in Quebec than, historically ever, previous to last couple elections. The fact that anyone's voting for the NDP in Quebec at all is surprising still. I think the NDP will remain a political party in Quebec in a meaningful sense, probably into the indefinite future. And that kind of gets me to sort of a broader thing, and I would like to hear your opinions on this, Doc, is that, I think what happens, and this isn't just a Canadian thing, but once a social democratic party sort of proves itself and gets into a position of opposition or forms government, basically all of the the capitalist parties or whatever, they all just merge together. So in Alberta, that's now the United Conservatives. In BC, it was the Conservatives, then the Socreds, now the Liberals. We have not seen that in most of the provinces of the country, but it seems like when the NDP gets into government, more often than not, that's just how it is from now on. And so I guess I'm wondering, do you think that... do you think there's a potential for that, I guess is what I'm saying? Do you think there's a potential for the NDP to gain that kind of solid, long-term support federally?
Yeah, well, there's two issues there. One is do we get into a situation where there's a stable long-term institutional structure? And then the second issue is that institutional structure degraded by being party of power? And I think that both issues are important, and I think that it's an across-the-board kind of thing. I mean, you have in the Quebec scene, Carl Bélanger and the ex-Mulcair crew crying, "Oh, you don't care about Quebec, you didn't make connections here." Well, everybody, sorry to say to them, everybody can say that. I can say that. Notley can say that. The Toronto core can say that. I mean, we can all cry, "Oh, we weren't listened to. We didn't have the kind of institutional connections that would allow us to break through." And so, what do we do about that? I think that we need to have a party that cares more about what the grassroots thinks in all areas, and uses the knowledge of the regional contradictions to propel a social democratic alternative to power. I mean, now the second question of does institutional power degrade? I think it does. I mean, the BC NDP has done some great things, and we can credit them and we can laud them. They've also done some hypocritical things, and sometimes the gears of power within that party, they might be a little bit blithe and a little bit disinterested in what the activists on the ground think about things. And I think that when you do that, you run the risk of alienating your most vibrant elements and becoming a sterile, hermetic, isolated institutional core, unable to subsequently win elections. And so you have the Quebec situation is, can Alexander Boularice rise to the level of, Tom Mulcair in his heyday, in his best, and build a social democratic alternative in Quebec? And that requires making connections with Quebec Solidaire, making connections with anyone who has a left-wing perspective, and seeing how you can move forward with that. In BC, it requires having a principled economic and environmental line and building connections with the most vibrant elements of the ecological left. In Alberta, it requires not excluding and suppressing the most vibrant, ecologically conscious voices. And the one we haven't mentioned is Toronto, where the NDP got completely shut out. For the record, I think that the NDP didn't make the right decision in Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou, and I would have liked to have run, and I think that I would have been able to handle the situation here and say, look, this is an acrimonious fight. Here's what we can say about it. But there were other, vetting issues across the country, like Sid Ryan and the Parkdale High Park situation, where I don't know if any of you know how to pronounce it, Shannon Gelbreze. But the point was that the NDP already had this slick candidate, Paul Taylor, picked out in advance, and they didn't really care what the community members wanted in that situation. And so when Shannon or Sharon had signed up all of these immigrant, working class immigrant members, and National dragged their heels on getting all of those people into the system such that they could vote. And it really alienated and demoralized a lot of people in Toronto for the National to have had this kind of slick, pre-programmed, scripted dog and pony show that they thought was more important than grassroots social democracy. And I think that hurt rather than helped the NDP there and across the country. I think that the point is that when you try to go in, I know that it was hard, and I know that there was limited resources, and I know that they were, this was a save the furniture kind of election. But I think that in Quebec, in Toronto, in British Columbia, and in Alberta, the exclusion of less scripted voices who could actually inspire communities of left-wing activists were given short shrift by the national structure, and that hurt the party rather than help the party. And so I don't want to get rid of Jagmeet Singh, but I do want the party to acknowledge and for left-wing activists across the country to really have a critical look at is the structure of the party empowering and encouraging grassroots, vibrant voices to change their communities in beneficial ways, or is it stifling and impeding them from doing so? I think that's not a question that's just particular to I have a beef and I'm mad about the situation here. I think that's an across the board question. And given that we didn't get 40 MPs and we didn't get 20% of the popular vote, as was predicted in the last days of the campaign, we have to have a critical look at, why didn't that happen, first of all, and would that have happened if there was a little bit more deference to the local communities and the local riding associations and the local people who really care about the issues that are pertinent to their communities?
I think that's fair. I guess. I mean, I don't know a single. Point me to the slick campaign that was like plopped out of nowhere that actually won this election for the NDP. Because it seems like
I think Leah Gazan is one, and I don't begrudge Leah at all. I think that Leah was a great candidate, but and I don't think that there was any problems with her being nominated. But it's just that there were kind of, these are the ones that matter, these are the ones that don't. And
yeah,
that's problematic.
I guess all I'm saying is, like, from the island where we vote pretty consistently NDP every time. Most of the people I talked to had no fucking idea even who their candidate was, nor did they care. It was just, hey, I'm going to vote NDP because, this is the Social Democratic. It's the party of the labor. It's the, union party. I was talking to a guy, Western Forestry Products has been on strike for like 3 months now. The whole island, actually, is basically forestry has been shut down since then. And I was talking to a guy on a picket line, and this was like a month and a half ago, and we started talking about the campaign and the election, right? We ended up talking about, like, what do you think the possibility is for the NDP? And I was like, yeah, it doesn't look so good. Like, they're probably going to lose a bunch of seats and stuff. And he's like, yeah, what are you going to do? Vote for him anyway. Like, you got to vote NDP. I mean,
well, we don't have to worry about strategic voting here. I mean,
well, for the most part,
with the singular exception, I mean, the Greens actually put up a pretty decent fight on the island. They retook Nanaimo, which I was very upset about. I was hoping to give them a black eye there with the NDP, but unfortunately they were reelected, and of course. Elizabeth May's extremely petty bourgeois bicycle riding conservatives up in the Gulf Islands.
Well, that's the Gulf Islands. I mean, they're a bunch of fucking weirdos who don't have real jobs.
So yeah, I mean, in somewhere here, like here, you vote NDP with the expectation that they're probably going to win. However, I am from the Okanagan originally. And my member of parliament growing up was Stockwell fucking Day, former leader of the batshit insane Alliance Party, and
the Pre-People's Party.
Yeah, and you just felt like every time you went to the ballot box, you were just like a cow going to slaughter. Like, there was not really any point to it other than a kind of symbolic, That being said, I think that. I think in the previous election, the NDP actually took Penticton's riding, which was fucking rad, and I think they retook it this time around. So maybe the tides are changing. It's not like a complete lost cause, but overall, like, I mean, if I was someone in Alberta or Saskatchewan or southern Manitoba, why would I even bother showing up to the polls at all? And I actually saw a really interesting tweet. Can't remember who said it, but they tallied. They divided the number of seats that each party won by the number of votes that people casted for them, and basically made a tally of, well, how much did each seat cost them in votes. So it only took the Liberals around 31,000 votes that they got on average per seat that they got in Parliament, versus the Green Party, on the other hand, was like 300,000 votes per seat that they got in Parliament. And, obviously these votes are expensive, quote unquote expensive, for the NDP as well. But this is just another problem with the with the first past the post system. And I would love to see the Conservative Party get on board, given this last election result, with proportional representation. Now, if they do that, I will eat my hat. There's no way in hell that they would actually support that. But I mean, they have plenty of cause to do it, because I mean, they would be in government right now if we had a properly democratic system.
Hey, now, to be fair, they are in government right now. They are in government right now. Their votes are going to be what's going to get these tax cuts and pipeline votes pushed through.
It's true.
Yeah, that's true.
There was actually a really good there was a really good article that I saw recently that was talking about how the perception of the government that we have right now is basically that the NDP holds power. The NDP
they have the votes.
Yes, they have the votes. But there's two things. Like, number one is that the NDP can't afford an election right now. They could barely afford the one that we just had. They had to take out a loan on the Jack Layton building in, I think it's Ottawa, so that I think they had to borrow against the real estate that they own just to fund the campaign that we just had. So calling another election right now would be suicide for the NDP. So they're not in a strong bargaining position, to say the least. The Liberals have a lot more in common with the Conservatives than they have with the NDP at all. So why it's just as possible for the Liberals to tack to the right to get the support of the Conservatives.
And I agree, and I take the point, and I think that it's important to note this kind of parliamentary alignment where, we've been sold this bill of goods that, the NDP has the balance of power, when really mathematically that's not true. And as you say, the Liberals are going to have the opportunity to pick and choose and buffet style select from the Conservatives, the Bloc, the Greens, and the NDP in this new parliament to achieve whatever they want. So what do? Ultimately, the position of the NDP becomes a more moral force than anything else. And in that kind of alignment, where the Liberals are going to be able to be, hypocrites and reactionaries and do these kind of cynical, opportunistic things, the only thing that the NDP has the power to do in the face of that is to call it out. And in that kind of alignment, you can't simply say, well, my position is X, Y, Z, and feel like that's going to be some sort of, moral kind of, people see that I have this position and therefore that's that. No, unfortunately, if you want to impede these, you have to make a vociferous, lengthy argument that inspires people to direct action and the mobilization of social forces for, a number of different purposes. And, if the NDP thinks that it can just have these kind of, index headings of we're for this, we're against that, and have that's not going to fly. That's because as you say, the Liberals have the opportunity to, in point of fact, simply buffet style select who's going to support their awful policies. So it becomes a kind of thing where the more important thing is the ability of the federal NDP caucus to lay out specifically why this is right, why that's wrong, in such a lengthy, comprehensive manner as to inspire social forces outside of Parliament to effect the decisions of Parliament and ultimately the decisions of the Liberals.
Yeah, I think that's that kind of gets, I guess, to the fundamental basic point, which is the extra parliamentarian politics that we're sort of all dancing around here. That, like, yes, an election happened. It wasn't very good. Well, minority government, whatever. Fucking who knows what'll happen in 4 months.
The literal line on it that we all have is it wasn't as bad as it could have been.
Okay, fair enough. But I do want to say to anyone who's out, I have seen way too much like Jugmeat won. Everything's great. We did good. And it's like, no, we didn't. No one did good. And everybody lost this election. Period. Nobody won this election. Arguably, the Bloc is the only party that actually won this election. Yeah. And even they only won on the basis of totally abandoning separatism. Which is like, so no one won, all right? Nobody won.
The Greens increased their seat count by 1/3.
Yeah, but even that was like, there was no breakthrough. There was no major thing for the Greens. They didn't win here on the island like they were really hoping to in a big way. And even the seats they won are like marginal, and they may lose again in the next election. Who knows?
Well, I think I agree with you, Mac, that this is the most important point, not just in Canada, but basically in any country, is the extra parliamentary outside of the government. And we see this kind of crystallizing right now in the Bernie Sanders campaign south of the border here in the United States, where he is abundantly aware of the fact that hypothetically speaking, if he wins the presidency, every other aspect of government is going to be fighting him tooth and nail to defeat every single one of his policies, because he's not just going to be taking on the status quo in kind of an ethereal sense, but a very, very changing the balance of power. He's coming out. He has, I think, even more of a radical platform than he did last time, where he's calling for increased employee ownership. He's coming out in support of federal card check unionization rules, which, by the way, I'm still waiting for here in British Columbia, Mr. John Horgan. And so he is abundantly aware of this and knows that he will fail if there is no grassroots democratic mobilization of the working class. And I think that the NDP here in Canada, as well as most social democratic parties in the Western world, have seen defeat after defeat after defeat, because these parties have lost support of the working class because they are more they're more associated with the kind of professional managerial class of the middle class white collar professionals and college academics and like university educated folk and whatnot, where by and large social democratic parties have completely abandoned their working class roots. And this is precisely why Jeremy Corbyn has been resoundingly successful in the UK, is that they are, picking that torch back up and carrying it, where, they are calling for, increased employee ownership and power in the economy and getting people mobilized outside of fucking elections. And I swear to God, if I get one more email from the NDP asking me for money, I'm gonna jump off my fucking balcony. Like, it's
yeah, come on, you're gonna get at least 10. You probably got 10 of those while we were recording today.
Yeah, while saying that sentence. And so if the NDP wants to or ever plans on getting that support back, and in fact eating support away from the Conservatives, is that they have to carry that torch of the working class, of fighting the capitalists, of making it easier to unionize, to increase public ownership, to figure out a way to expand employee ownership, workers' cooperatives, all that shit. That is really the only way forward for the NDP if they want to be able to not just survive elections and do better in elections, but if they are able to get into power, to be able to wield that effectively.
Yeah, that's fair. I do think the NDP has, institutionally perhaps not, because obviously it's still very much connected to the CLC and to basically every labor federation, even Alberta, the Alberta Federation of Labor, although, to be fair, I think the Alberta Federation of Labor is putting out way better, points than Rachel Notley is. She's kind of just abandoned the labor movement at this point. I don't even really think she knows what the Alberta Fed is saying. But yeah, I think that the party has, broadly speaking, from the activist layer, like the people who do shit in the party, has definitely abandoned the working class. I think the party itself is still oriented to the working class, and working people can say yeah, of course I'm going to vote Social Democratic, or I'm going to vote for the party that's my union party, whatever. But the thing that fucking baffled me just after the election was a tweet I read that I think exemplifies this total disconnection from reality. And I'm not going to say who it is. You can find it. It's on whatever. It's a tweet. I don't want to just slag off this one guy because I don't know who he is. If I knew who he was, I would slag him off. But he posted 9,375 is the number of Canadians needed to donate $1,600 to the NDP. What can 9,375 Canadians donating $1,600 to the NDP do? It can raise $15 million. We need this money to pay debts and prepare for election 44.
Well, I'll whip out my wallet and my extra $1,600 for the.
It's funny you should say that too, because
and you know what the worst part was? Isn't just this tweet. This was posted on the Facebook group Leftist Memes for New Democratic Teens, which I'm a member of. For whatever reason, I'm not a teen, but fucking whatever, it rhymes. And the worst part is that the response was broadly supportive of this post. They're like, yeah, we need the money. Help us out. This is important. And a couple of people were like, what the fuck are you talking about?
It's
and they were downvotes, unhappy face, shit. Just
it's funny too, because I got asked multiple times by the NDP. I threw them a little bit of money during the election because why not? But when they called me and asked me, they're like, Ben, we really appreciate your support. We were hoping that you would be able to donate $400 to the party. And I thought I had misheard them at first. I was like, $400 fucking dollars? And I was wondering, like, why would they do that? And then it occurred to me that back during the leadership race for the NDP, when Nikki Ashton was running and I was a part of her campaign, we had hosted an event here in Victoria that was held at the Victoria Events Center, and I paid for the event center that night, which was about $450, and I got most of that back through like the tax credit or whatever that you get through political party donations. But I guess they must have seen that in my donation history and be like, "Whoa, the fucking buddy's Moneybags Ben over here is gonna give us another $400." It's like, bro, I'm sorry.
For what?
Yeah, I don't...
So I can get it back in a year?
Yeah.
I don't have like $1,600, and I love the idea that this guy is like, yeah, there's totally 9,000 people in Canada who would give that money. I will bet there is not. That and this is, I guess, what I'm getting at here is like the thing I think the NDP needs to do is fucking shit can all of this fucking marketing palaver. Going to, like, basically it seems like the NDP is going to the same marketing firms that liberals and conservatives go to. We just have less money, so the effect is worse. Like, that seems to be all we're doing. We're just pissing away millions of dollars.
Here, I don't know if you guys will indulge me here, but I'd like to list read my list of terrorist demands on air.
Oh my God! You put a mic to my head.
Because here's the thing is that what do we need to do? What needs to be done for the interior here? Because this is the thing for me is that, fine, I get thrown under the bus and, they decide that that's where I can do the most good is under the bus. Fine, whatever. I don't get my 3 minutes at this candidate forum or that one. But it's a much longer thing. And what I'd really like is, I've been at law school here at Thompson Rivers University for 2 years. And being a law student and trying to uphold social democratic values in a fairly conservative, but not wholly conservative, riding, this riding is not a write-off. It's not just a solidly blue riding. It potentially could be won by a social democrat. Being here for 2 years, the party grandees, the important social democratic voices that are really cool, who are all clustered around Vancouver, they don't come out here. And who does come out here? Trudeau does. Trudeau has been out here 2 or 3 times, and he's cavorting around with Terry Lake, the Liberal, and he's doing talks at the law school in the House of Learning and doing town halls. And it's kind of demoralizing to when people are excited and going to events that are liberals. And I know that there's limited resources, whatever, but from Burnaby, it's a 3.5-hour drive up to Kamloops, 3 if you really kind of push it on the Coquihalla. And I would really love it if the party between the BC NDP and the federal NDP really made the interior a priority. I think that it's been a problem with the provincial party and the federal party that they just see these things as equivalent to Alberta or Saskatchewan, and they're not. I mean, the point is that, what are the terrorist demands that I'm reading out on the air here? Come here, meet the interior union leaders, meet the Secwepemc people. Right now, Secwepemc, land warriors basically are fighting the Trans Mountain Pipeline by themselves without help, and they're being arrested and harassed, and that's shitty and uncool. And I would really love it if the party cared enough about that, problem to have a presence here and be opposing that. And they haven't done that yet. And now that the election, this god-awful election where nobody got what they wanted and, we made it through with largely skin intact, we now have some time in which the NDP can and should come out here. I understand that the leaders and the grandees can't go to every riding in Canada, but Kamloops is a really populous place. It's a fairly big city for the interior. And to just kind of to say, oh, well, we don't need to have a presence there. We don't need to, be there once a year or whatever and make inroads with the left community. I think that's just not good enough. And now that we have an opportunity after this election where we made it through, they have the time to do that. And I would really invite Don Davies, Peter Julian, Jenny Kwan, Jagmeet Singh, and Sven Robinson and whoever else to come out and make their faces known, to say, hey, it's not just a downtown Vancouver clique. This is a British Columbian and a Canadian, movement of social democracy. That message, that interconnected kind of, we're all one community and we like the best voices care about everybody else's community. That hasn't been made yet, and it needs to be made going forward.
I would love for the NDP to be accurately described as a movement someday. They use that term a lot, and I mean, the NDP kind of functions as just an electoral machine with no real movement to be seen. So I personally think that that's the biggest thing that needs to change about the NDP if it wants to kind of get involved in people's lives and see be able to be a mobilizing force outside of elections. Just, kind of as we're sort of starting to wrap up here, Doc, especially given your personal involvement with the party, I wanted to ask you that, a lot of people are seeing that the NDP did not perform as well as they did in the last election. They lost a bunch of seats. They didn't do particularly well in Quebec. The overall, it was kind of a lackluster showing for the NDP.
And a shit show.
So, a lot of people are calling for Jagmeet Singh to step down as leader. And, if you would have asked me this 6 months ago, I would have said, sure, hell yeah, get Jagmeet, step down. I want Nikki Ashton or someone else to be the leader. But, he did pretty well overall, other than a couple flip-flops that I've already mentioned. He did okay.
He's good.
But I don't think that I don't think the real core of the problems with the NDP are necessarily with him. What do you think, other than what we've already discussed? How do you see? What do you think the NDP really needs to change in order, kind of looking forward, given this recent kind of lackluster election result for the party?
Well, to give you a narcissistically personal answer is that
Go on.
After I got, they say, oh, you can't run, you've had this acrimonious thing with two pipeline, activists 2 years ago. I got messages from basically, everyone across the political spectrum saying, we understand there are fights. We wouldn't have done this, And so what needs to change is that if the NDP wants to become a movement, it needs to know the people that are in it. It needs, I don't think that anyone who knows me would have been surprised at the fact that I said I'd like to break the jaw of a pro-pipeline activist in 2017. I don't think that would just blow the minds of anyone who's ever met me. That's.
I just want to say clearly, for the record, you have said worse things to me in person. To me.
Exactly, right? Sorry to be the malcontent of the bunch, but it's sometimes I got a lousy mouth, but that doesn't mean that I don't care about my community, and that I think that it should impede me from making cogent arguments to the effect of economic development and environmental protections, this, that, or the other thing. And what really the salient point that I'm trying to get across is that I don't know these people who are phoning me from National. And after the election, they haven't phoned back or emailed me. They haven't talked. They haven't said anything. There's been no communication whatsoever. And the lack of communication on all sides contributes to this kind of, war room mentality of, oh, we got to, throw this person under the bus or not talk about that person. I mean, there was another example, Jessa McLean, who's an Ontario candidate who's also said that, National is kind of, uncommunicative, and they don't really have the level of support. And what place does that come from? It comes from a place of us not knowing one another, us not knowing what one another are about, us not knowing what the communities of activists are trying to achieve in each regional area. And you started the question off by saying a lot of people are calling for Jagmeet's head. I don't want to get rid of Jagmeet Singh. I think that Jagmeet Singh was an excellent spokesperson. He did the best he could with the limited resources and time that he had. I think that some of the apparatus around him, some of the people who were making decisions, made myopic decisions simply because they aren't cognizant of all of the regional areas, all of the kind of activist base, what those activist bases are trying to achieve in their areas. And were they to have been cognizant of that, they might have made different decisions. And now we have a 4-week to 4-year window, depending on if we can avoid an election, to make those connections, to become cognizant of one another, to become cognizant of what we're all trying to achieve in our own political spheres, and to try to see if we can make those struggles link up with one another. And, that's my hope. That's my dream for the NDP, for it to become a vibrant, grassroots, social democratic movement where we all know what we're trying to achieve, and we work with one another where we can to achieve those things. I hope that that's a possibility in the coming years.
Mac, is there anything else you wanted to bring up?
No, I think that's pretty good. That's a pretty good way to end. I mean, I don't have like a nice, neat, solution for the party. I do think it just needs to be a little less, bureaucratically run, psychotically on message, in elections only, and then it like evaporates outside of elections. That would be my thing.
Yeah, be a little loose. Be a little, be a little little less scripted.
Because I just want to say, like, it's actually not that serious. It's just it's just a middling political party. It's like not a big deal that some dickhead in Kamloops, sorry, Doc, said some things a couple years ago that are like, yeah, that was kind of a dumb thing to say. Sure. It's like, what the fuck does it matter? What is this? And they act like this, like, I mean, this is the thing, I guess, the only criticism I'd make of the NDP uniquely is just how obsessed they seem to be with image, with, like, their media presence, with, like, what people think of them. But to be fair, it's either no one thinks of them, or the media's always going to hate social democratic policies, so fuck it. Like, just make a case for what you actually believe and bring people together on the basis of that. That would be my ideal version of the NDP.
Agreed.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think that's probably a pretty stellar place to wrap up. Doc, did you have any final thoughts before we say our goodbyes?
Yes, just to reiterate that the interior is not a lost cause. This is a winnable riding. I thank Cynthia Egley for picking up the torch and running the campaign that she did. She's a great person, and she too deserves a really structured, longer campaign. She got thrown in on the deep end, and she did the best that she could with it. But we could do a lot better if we all talked with one another and we knew where each other was coming from, and we were all on the same page. And I hope that's the case going forward.
Yeah, I mean, we focus on the West because we're here, but I would love to know more about what's going on in Ontario.
Well, especially since I guess the Liberals completely cleaned up in Toronto. The NDP didn't win a single fucking riding in Toronto.
Yeah, well, what are you going to do? I mean, there's nothing to it. They didn't run anyone good there. Sorry.
And with that
they didn't run anyone well there.
Well, Doc, thank you so much for being on the show again. We appreciate it. All the best wishes to you and Kamloops, and that was a great discussion. We appreciate it.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
Hell yeah. I hope to have you on again sometime. And also, everyone, thank you so much for listening. Thanks a million to our new Patreon subscribers. I think we're still pulling in at $69 a month.
Keep that number up.
Yeah.
I mean, it's...
Our next goal is $420 a month, obviously. Please do like our Facebook page, follow us on SoundCloud. Our Twitter handle is @RealUlf. And thank you so much for listening. We appreciate it. We love you all. Fully automated luxury gay space comedy.